And Kathleen, I'll do
Sure.
Kathleen, I'll do the first three, and then yours, right? And then you'll turn it back over when you're ready.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome. As I pull up my slides, if you are here to talk about AI in government and how to use it ethically and responsibly, you are definitely in the right place. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to dive deep on the risks involved with using AI and how to mitigate them. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tyler Sweedock. I am the Executive Director here at the Colorado Smart Cities Alliance. We work with governments all over the state to help them identify and implement innovative technology solutions. And AI is one of those big tools that governments now have to leverage in order to improve infrastructure in their communities. So we are going to dive into ethical and responsible use. Hopefully, this isn't your first time attending an event in this series. As a reminder, we had our first webinar on how AI works a couple of weeks ago. This is our second webinar in a three-part series focused on how to use it ethically and responsibly. And then on June 20th, about 3 weeks from now, we will be hosting an AI showcase where we'll actually be in person for those of you that can join us at the CSU Spur campus here in Denver, showcasing all sorts of different ways that governments can use AI to solve different problems within government. We hope you can join us for that, and we hope to see you there. A quick update for that event. We just announced, I believe, yesterday that Governor Polis will be joining us to give the keynote remarks. We'll also be joined by Representative Titone, who chairs the Joint Technology Committee for the Colorado State Legislature. It'll begin at 3 p.m. We'll have some wonderful drinks and food and lots of AI for you to get hands-on with. And then we'll wrap up around 6. So we hope you can join us. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of us. Hope to see you there. Okay, so for today, we are going to, as I mentioned, dive pretty deep into the risk that AI represents within government, some use cases that represent those risks, and some tools that have been developed that governments can use to help mitigate those risks, both internally and with potential partners or vendors that you might be contemplating. We'll then be followed by a facilitated discussion, and hopefully we'll get some great questions from the audience and have a chance for our panelists to answer those as well. So here is who is going to be speaking with you today, experts in different aspects of what we're going to be talking about. Kathleen McInerney is with Turaco Strategy, but she used to be with Yahoo and eBay and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, an expert in privacy, policy, government affairs, all sorts of things related to this topic. Scott Blumenreich, also with Turaco Strategy, former CIO of the City of Centennial, and Deputy CIO for the National Renewable Energy Lab. And Emily Royal, who is the Smart Cities Administrator for the City of San Antonio. She's also the co-chair of the policy working group for the Gov AI Coalition. And she's going to be talking a lot about the work that coalition has been doing with about 200 governments across the country to develop responsible and practical AI guidelines. So I will stop sharing my screen. Kathleen, I will hand it over to you, and we can get started with the presentation portion of this.
Okay, I think we're ready. Scott, if you want to get it kicked off.
Sure. Let me go ahead and get it kicked off. I know we've got 45 minutes for these presentations before we get to the panel discussions, which, in my opinion, are probably the most important. We've had some very interesting organic conversations between the 3, 4 of us, 5 of us over the past month or so getting ready for this. As Tyler pointed out, this is on the heels of Ken Fricklis's and Ken Fricklis and Suman's talk a couple of weeks ago. on how it all works. I think it was pretty comprehensive. And what we've tried to do is put together sort of a global view for mine and Kathleen's portion of this on ethics and responsibility. And then I know Emily's going to hammer away at some real life things that you guys can use from a municipality perspective as quickly as possible. Our agenda today is talking about getting started. We're going to talk about risk analysis. We're going to give a bit of a regulatory overview, some risk assessment and mitigation concepts there. We're going to talk about governance. Governance is, sort of a very blanket term for a number of different things. We'll give you a little bit of process flow for an AI implementation. We'll talk about some of the critical business functions, and although the examples are numerous, we'll just hit on a few of them. And then there's a wonderful Gov site for use cases that I think everyone would find very, very useful as time goes on. And we'll do that and then close for our portion of this. So with that, can I have the next slide, Kathleen? Okay, so important definitions, and you can see I've taken them from 3 different sources, but it's important to remember that, we're not just talking about a simulator, really. We're talking about a type of technology that has become ubiquitous incredibly quickly. And I don't know that humans adjust to quickly that well anymore, even though it may seem as though our days are filled with firsts. But within the AI world, we're talking about algorithms, we're talking about neural networks, and it's meant to imitate human behavior. It is not human behavior in and of itself. Ethics, I thought this was a very simple but perfect definition. Ethics examine the rational justification for our moral judgments. It studies what's morally right or wrong, just or unjust. And as we've all heard so consistently, that responsible AI and ethics go together, with responsible AI being an approach to developing, assessing, and deploying AI systems in a safe, trustworthy, and ethical way. And that may mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I think we can all tell the difference between good and evil, and our intentions should really always be good when it comes to this technology, especially this early on with it being refined. Okay, next slide. Kathleen, I think you're up.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Tyler, for the invitation. And thank you to everyone for joining. It's interesting to speak into the black box of Zoom and know that your words are going to erroneously or not turn out to be education fodder for an AI LLM. But let's get started. So yay, you all have decided to use AI. But are you sure? The dangers of AI are known and real. However, there are many forms of AI, and most are benign. As we develop and deploy more advanced AI systems and technologies, our concerns grow, and so do the challenges of regulating them. Consider this list. The challenges on this list are global in nature and require a concerted and coordinated effort to ensure that the most dangerous AI applications are never realized. The enforcement mechanisms are realistic, and the benefits of the technologies are universally accessible and free from discrimination. This last challenge is the most applicable for today's discussion, what we're going to be digging into. How can local government agencies safely, effectively, and fairly use AI to benefit their system of stakeholders? Well, knowing the dangers, you still want to use AI. Fair enough. AI should be used to make our lives easier, right? Should be used to make our decisions better and more informed. What are the things that we can do and ways that we can approach AI to make it true for our use case? First, let's do a little bit of a regulatory overview. So some of the regulatory and compliance considerations that are applicable in most applications of AI are still nascent. So the regulations are, although some jurisdictions have passed regulations, most have not. And the regulations that have been passed build on years of work in this area, and they're seeking to address the real and potential negative externalities of the technologies, such as magnified bias in hiring, credit, or housing practices. While most jurisdictions are still debating approaches or considering legislation, some of these governments, as I mentioned, have already acted. In the US, we have the Executive Order on AI and related executive orders, state-level legislation, such as what we have here in Colorado, as well as sectoral rules, requirements, regulations, public sector requirements that are specific to government agencies, and data protection regulations that address AI specifically. And that's something I think that's worth noting, is that a lot of the AI regulations that have been passed so far can be found in privacy or data protection legislation or regulation. The EU is taking a multi-pronged approach to regulation through data laws, sector approaches, public sector requirements, and the EU AI Act. In the UK, the approach is sectoral. So each of the different government agencies have their own mandate to come up with regulations around AI and its use within their sector, and simultaneously heavily reliant upon case law. One important thing to think about is, as these different jurisdictions go or think about regulations in the AI space, one of the things that's very much informing their approach is what is most critical to their economies at this time, and what is that they're trying to achieve. We can talk about that a little bit more in the question and answer, but the EU has typically been led by a more human rights central approach, whereas the UK and the US are looking at it more from an innovation standpoint. Now, depending on your use case, it is advisable to check with your legal team on applicable requirements. Some of the principles that are underlying these regulations are really seeking to achieve good and to eliminate these harms. And they're also coming up against a pretty abysmal track record globally on regulating technology. So in this space, you see that there's a movement to do better with regulating AI and ensuring that the regulations are appropriate, timely, and enforceable. And by timely, what I'm talking about is that these regulations are actually put in place before some of the potential harms of AI are realized. In addition, there's a recognition that these technologies are built by a select and privileged few, primarily men, primarily white, and primarily based in the United States. So these principles aim to democratize the development and application of AI technologies, regardless of who develops, informs, or tests them, so that the benefits can be applied equitably across diverse populations and geographies. This has a lot of information. I'm definitely not going to go into all of this information, but you'll have this slide deck afterwards, so you can reference this. So a very brief, albeit dense word on the EU AI Act. This is the first and most comprehensive risk framework for AI regulation, and so it does merit our consideration. We can assume that this will be used as a guide for many future regulations and requirements. Moreover, and this is really important, it is a reflection of public sentiment regarding what is fair, expected, and appropriate for AI technology. There are 4 categories of regulated risk, and each category has requirements and limitations on the application of the technologies that fall into that category. Most government agency deployment of AI technologies or systems would likely fall in the category of high risk under the EU risk framework. This does not ban such use, but it does require you to think about additional risk assessment, audits, and risk mitigation strategies. The most common uses of AI, however, are in the minimal risk category. Such uses would probably not even require disclosure to the people who are receiving those services, such as entertainment applications. Like, none of us really need to be informed when we're watching a Hollywood movie that if we're seeing aliens invade terrorists, that never actually happened. So motion picture or entertainment purposes specifically, or spam filters, for example, are uses of AI technology that don't even require disclosure, and they're considered minimal risk or free use. So as you're thinking about what is the technology that you want to deploy and under what risk category does it fall, here are some strategies to think about how you can mitigate the risks that you may encounter. First, be deliberate and highly selective when considering tools. Anticipate problems those tools may bring. Always assume the worst, and use all the tools available to you to learn about the technology. Ask questions of the developers. Understand the testing environments they have exposed their solutions to, and the data they use to train their models. Consider your stakeholders and their unique concerns, histories, and needs. And for government agencies, this is really important because no one will understand your stakeholders quite the way that you do. And also nobody will really understand what is the historic environment in which you're operating that would need to be mitigated in any deployment of technologies generally, but specifically for AI technology. Be transparent. Tell your stakeholders when you are using AI and why. Where appropriate, ensure that subjects have the right to opt out of the use of AI technology. Data. Quick word on data. This is at the heart of AI and is the most regulated aspect of its development and application. I can't overstate how important it is that you understand what data is being used to train the AI model and what data is required for you or others to input into that model for it to best function. When you're doing this, you should follow best-in-class privacy practices and work with your IT team to ensure that cybersecurity measures are implemented. Account for human history. What does this mean? Don't use AI that is trained on discriminatory data without considering its impact and mitigating the risks and harms to your cities, citizens, employees, and your critical infrastructure. Make sure that the AI system has been tested in the real world and not just in controlled environments. Seek diversity. Take a diverse approach. The individuals that will be impacted by your decisions will be diverse. Account for this by seeking diverse opinions and perspectives in your decision-making process and in the risk mitigation design. And this goes beyond thinking about the racial or gender makeup of the people that will be impacted, but also the professional background. So think about who you have in your city that you can reach out to that could have a perspective that would be valuable in how you design your risk mitigation strategies, and think outside your department. Audit and assess. Have clear parameters for success and remediation for failures, and make sure you establish a regular cadence for doing so. Finally, you, who I assume is a human, made the choice to use this technology to help you do your job and serve your stakeholders better. If something goes wrong, it is important to remember that as a human, we have to take accountability, and we can't blame our AI solutions for real-life problems that might come out as a consequence of that use, especially if those consequences could have been anticipated and mitigated in advance. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Scott.
Thanks, Kathleen. Very good. I think everyone already gets the sense, if you haven't been up on this particular aspect of the information related to AI, that it's not just complicated technically, it's complicated morally, it's complicated from a process of development, a release, a utilization perspective in every way. So this is really just a reminder of what we're talking about with AI, the technology underneath all of the regulatory elements and the compliance components. We've got machine learning, which has been around for some time now. We've got deep learning. That's what we would look to our LLMs for, basically, our large language models. We have natural language processing, which means we can now talk to the bot, and it can do its work behind the scenes without us having to necessarily type in prompts consistently. That we're starting to see the benefits of NLP, I think, in a lot of the robotics activities that are going on. The human-like bots are now using both natural language processing and computer vision in order to perform tasks or be trained on tasks. So this is the underlying technology component. And if you can move to the next slide, Kathleen. Governance is a big word. It means a lot of different things, and it means different things to different people and different groups. And, just to sort of set the stage, with governance, generally speaking, as we will, being policies and procedures and standards and compliance components that are necessary to do work in a regulated or quasi-regulated environment. There's many different elements, and if you just think about these next few slides in the context of having a very strong quality program. Not everyone is a software development company. Not everyone can spend huge sums of money or perhaps not even very much money on the type of resources internally that it takes in order to develop software. Now, this may be extremely complex software. It may be extremely complex hardware. And the reality is that I think most of us are just kind of Google-eyed at what it can do and what it can't do. But we have to remember that there needs to be some controls in place. And that's really what we're talking about with a quality program. Governance is just a blanket term for a set of controls. How do we ensure that what we are creating is performing the way that it's purported to perform? I said it was going to do X, Y, and Z. And is it doing that? Is it doing X, Y, and Z? Or is it doing A, B, C? Or is it doing that and 1, 2, 3? I mean, the reality is that we already know generally from the articles you can read daily in any newspaper, more or less the tech journals, that we have issues that are beginning to demonstrate themselves perhaps more frequently with AIs. The hallucination issue, AIs that lie, AIs that are being taught to lie, and AIs that forget. Or the most recent one I've read about is AIs that become lazy. And I've actually seen that because I put in the same prompt a month or two apart, and where the first time I put in the prompt, I got 5 pages of information. And the next time that I put in the prompt, I got, 2 paragraphs of information. Which says to me that the AI didn't necessarily know that it had already given me all the other information, or maybe it did, but it certainly did not give me the wealth or breadth of information that was necessary. So in relation to AI governance, we're referring to the guardrails that ensure AI tools and systems are and remain safe and ethical. It establishes a framework of rules and standards that direct AI research, development, and application to ensure safety, fairness, and respect for human rights. That came out of IBM last year. I thought that that's probably one of the most well-rounded definitions that I've seen so far. So what are the components? Again, I want those of you in IT or those of you who are associated with your IT departments to think about basic system development lifecycle covenants. You've got external guidance and internal guidance. You should be doing risk and hazard analysis on any application that's going to touch the public, at the very least, if not some of your internal processes and systems. You should do it with AI and impact analysis. So as a for instance, many of you may have seen, and I'm sorry I did not put a reference up to it, but there was about a 1-minute video that was generated a couple of months ago by Sora, which develops video, an AI that builds video. And it was of a woman walking down a street in Tokyo in a dark evening. And I mean, it was really kind of luscious. Now, there was a lot of mistakes that were going on. I mean, maybe the feet went a little crooked or went behind one another while she was walking. So you could see there was still some imperfections in the video. But if you think about what it would have cost for a full film team to take on that trip from the United States, let's say, go to Japan, bring all of their equipment, rent equipment there on site, bring in electricians, grips, bring in photographers, have a director, have actors, and you think about all of the costs associated with doing that 1-minute video. And now think about the fact that a computer did it and it took minutes to render. So how many people were put out of work during, with that 1-minute video? I mean, I've seen a roster related to that. And it goes all the way down to camera manufacturers and lens manufacturers, and people who create and develop the equipment that is used to film. And so it's really no wonder that you would find that, SAG and AFTRA artists are very concerned about their images being used. And of course, there's a lot of legalities there that need to play out, aside from what we saw from the writer's strike a few months ago. So impact assessment, this is what I'm building. This is what it's supposed to do. Now, once I release it, what's it going to be? I'll give you one more example. When Uber released, at the very beginning of its entrenching the US, even prior to Lyft launching, what we saw in New York City were cab drivers whose families had saved for, perhaps multiple generations to buy medallions which allowed them to operate yellow cabs in New York City. Those medallions sell for approximately $1 million. I mean, I haven't checked recently, but I know that number to be true. And so in steps Uber, and now all of a sudden something a family, probably multiple generations of a family, have used to support their lives daily, and also an extremely large investment that probably took generations to come to, was immediately under conflict. And this issue should be applied across all of the uses of technology and those types of impact assessments that we're talking about. So we've got policies. Those are going to come internally, procedures. If you don't have any written yet, I advise you to at least write some high-level ones around the type of what you're going to do with AI. Do you have any basic rules or regulations that you can put in there? I think the EU reference, the EU Act reference, is a great place to start. As Kathleen said, it's very human-centered. As far as standards are concerned, we're talking, perhaps vendor-related standards. How are you going to look at vendors? What are you going to do with vendors when you go to buy a new application, implement an enterprise application as AI sitting behind it? What type of disclosure are you going to require from your vendors so you understand exactly how they're doing? There may be some intellectual property, some IP you can't get your hands on, but you need to think about the terms of use that they're going to be putting forth to you, that you're going to be signing up for, and really take control of that vendor experience. Now, with that said, having spent quite a bit of time in and around government, I know that procurement is a very important activity, and there are procurement rules and regs that most organizations have, certainly municipalities. And yet at the same time, this type of technology is going to call for a intermediated review and collaboration between your IT departments, your business departments, and procurement as well. So don't forget, this is a multiplayer game right now, and we need all of the gray matter that we can get involved. So yeah, that's okay. Go ahead, Kathleen. So last on that was life cycle documentation. I think that still stands. You should always have a requirements doc. You want your business analysts involved with building that out so that people understand, and have that move through design and implementation, testing and implementation documentation. So as far as a general process flow, this is obviously very general, but it stood the test of time. Identify and define your problem. What problem you are solving with your AI implementation? Consider your project goals and needs. How does technology assist in achieving that goal? And are you using the tech because it's cool or because its use is justified in its application? And so, do you need AI? I would always take a step back and say that in the short term, it may seem like an easy solution, but longer term, there may be issues associated with it and administrative issues that are going to complicate things. What are the implications of the project? We talked about that. Parameters for measuring success. I mean, we all want to be data-driven these days. There's no doubt about that. So you should understand that to begin with. What data is going to be used? Is it going to come from a technical source, or is it going to be, what data is the project going to use? What data was any AI trained on? Again, as Kathleen mentioned, you have control over what you train an AI on. You don't have control over what ChatGPT or Mistral or Gemini or any of them are training on. And I don't think there's been full releases yet of that information. And I don't expect there to be, because that becomes part of their IP. Bias analysis. I think this is extremely important. Bias is probably the number one item that I hear discussed most frequently related to implementation of any AI system. And how do you prove that? Well, I mean, number one, this is not just a technical effort. You need to make sure you've got humans in the loop. That has its own little acronym now, HITL, HITL. But it's extremely important. And that's not just your developers. That would probably be some business folks as well. Understand your data sources, as I was just saying, and the implications of them. It's always good. I mean, this is something kind of additive and maybe a little specific to AI, even though, we might be looking at, different success parameters or bias analysis. But what about harm analysis? I mean, I go back to my Uber example. Was the harm that the generational families were going to come to with the advent of Uber even thought about when Uber was released? Maybe, maybe not. I wasn't there. And last but not least, don't forget that you need performance controls, and cybersecurity around AI is probably going to be even more important than cybersecurity around every other application that you've got out there. Next slide, please, Kathleen. Right. So let me preface this slide by saying, having been in IT leadership for quite a while at this point in my life, I've dealt with shadow IT across my entire career. And, I think that on one hand, we don't want to stifle innovation. We don't want to stifle success. And so I've always felt as though I wanted to work with the business. And I think this IT's job, in my humble opinion, to work with the business to understand their needs. If there's shadow IT, I take that as a gap in the services that I can provide. Can you hop back for 1 second, Kathleen? It's okay. The slides were jumping around on me last night when I was reviewing them too. Anyway, let's just go through this list. That's my hyperbole on shadow IT. But, communications with stakeholders, that's a very important area. I mean, if you start giving out incorrect information, or information that is not real or founded in reality, then of course, as one very wise city attorney once said to a group I was in, you can spend years building your reputation, but it just takes a few minutes to lose it. And so obviously with communication, you're out there to a much, much larger group. Staffing bias, we've heard about this already, many of us. I mean, it's in the paper consistently. So human resources has to watch out. In transportation, as AI automated functions start making their way into our larger intelligent transportation systems, rather than just being a highly tuned expert system, which many of them are right now, with hundreds of parameters. When AI starts making the decisions, what if it's a snowstorm and you've got a bunch of black cars and a white car, and can it differentiate, and or do you end up with a bigger mess on the road than you would have hoped for? Law enforcement, facial recognition has been all over the news for the past few years. I have my own feelings on that, but let's just say that anyone who is involved with law enforcement and any facial recognition programs really needs to be taking the utmost concern and recognize that their efforts in relation to quality, security, lack of bias are incredibly important. Public health and safety, especially critical infrastructure. We haven't seen it make its way in yet that deeply. However, we're already having problems with critical infrastructure and foreign bad actors, bad, state actors, and or hacking groups supported by them are sitting across critical infrastructure in the US, and I'm sure we're sitting on theirs as well. But once AI takes over, that will change the dynamics. And of course, finance, it's easy to punch a button or type in that prompt and ask for a projection of next year's revenues. But, again, how much work went into validating that what ended up in your CFO's hands is the correct information. So all things to be thought about. I knew there wouldn't really be time to work through many use cases, but I have this great site. It's ai.gov for those of you who don't know. It'll be in the presentation, and Tyler's going to post this when we're done. It seems to me that the US government has started asking all of its agencies to provide information on what applications it has related to AI and or expert systems, what's operational, what's not. And this is a great place to get started. So if you're looking to understand the type of information you want to document up front. And Kathleen, I think you've got the last slide 2 down now. There you go.
Yeah, and this is just hopefully a funny reminder that AI cannot solve our societal or individual problems, but it can exacerbate them. And at the end of the day, they're tools. So far, since we don't have sentient robots who are deciding everything, so far they are tools that reflect the humans that have designed and used them. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you both, Kathleen and Scott, for walking us through risks and areas for opportunity within local government. And I also want to preface and frame the discussion around, we also want governments, and I believe both of you talked about this, to be exploring how AI could help them in their day-to-day jobs, but we want them to be very cautious and conscientious about where the risks may lie in different use cases. And so, Emily, I'm excited to hand it over to you and talk about some of the real tools that have been developed with the GovAI Coalition that can help governments assess that risk and mitigate it.
For sure. Thanks, Tyler. And thanks, Kathleen and Scott, for that presentation. It was really insightful and awesome to just frame the issue in such a comprehensive and easy to understand way. I'm going to share my screen real quick and jump into it. Make sure that works. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Royal. I am sitting in the balmy city of San Antonio, Texas. And I manage our Smart Cities program in our Information Technologies Services Department at the City of San Antonio. I want to talk to you a little bit today about the GovAI Coalition, which is really a volunteer-based coalition of public agencies that are all working together to address policy issues and governance around artificial intelligence technology. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about how it got started in the fall of last year. Several agencies started talking together, just civil servants talking about some of the challenges that we had in really pushing for responsible AI practices in our contracting with vendors. We would get told often that, these technologies are proprietary, that, we can't have access to the data model for IP concerns, but also, can have access to some basic metrics that provide information about the performance of these tools and whether or not they've been tested for bias, for example, as Kathleen and Scott both mentioned as an issue for AI. And so in this conversation, we started to think, well, one of our biggest problems is these companies will say, hey, San Antonio, if your rules, are too strict for us, we're just going to go sell to any number of other cities in the United States. So what if these agencies got together and started saying, well, let's create our own guiding principles and best practices. And if we align on our values for AI technology and our governance procedures for it, we might be able to build a stronger voice in the development of AI tech for the public sector. And so that is the spirit of the organization and a conversation that happened last summer. And we founded the GovAI Coalition in the fall of last year. The agencies, I want to give them huge kudos and shout out on the bottom. All of these agencies are part of that founding team. So San Jose is a big player in this space. They host most of our infrastructure for the coalition. Long Beach, San Diego, Cleveland, St. Paul, Minnesota, in the county of San Diego as well as Colorado State. So for those of you who are living and working in Colorado, your state agency is also involved in this coalition. We've grown significantly. It's a hot button issue. So we currently have over 250 public agencies represented across the U.S. That includes, metropolitan transportation systems. It includes river authorities. It includes state level government. It includes municipal government. Really, any public agency can be a member. But also, we have about 40 nonprofits and NGOs that are engaged. And we don't restrict our membership just to public agencies. We also invite the research community and the private sector to be part of our meetings as well. So what exactly are we doing and building, as a coalition? Really what we're trying to do is help public agencies go from 0 to 90 using AI in government by addressing really some of the key concerns that we've heard among our membership and providing deliverables, plug and play templates and documents that will help public agencies really get up to speed in AI. So we address 5 central questions as a coalition. First, where do I start? How do I prepare my agency to govern the use of AI in my organization? We built a policy template that I'll cover briefly in a couple slides, as well as a manual that kind of helps you think about how to design and develop governance around AI in your organization. We also are reflecting quite a bit on, what are some use cases and sharing best practices for different use cases of AI across the country. We have use case templates and guides for specific use cases, things ranging from computer vision or object detection for solid waste management, for example, all the way to, public-facing chatbots for resident engagement. The third question we're looking at is, who can I work with in this space? We have a very powerful tool that I love. It is called the AI fact sheet. It functions basically as a nutrition facts for vendors, and we request as part of our governance model that vendors respond to this questionnaire about AI tools and technologies. And when they do, we upload their responses into an AI registry that is shared among members of the coalition. And hopefully that incentivizes companies to be proactive about sharing, information, being transparent about how their tools and systems work, of course, protecting their right to protect their own IP. Fourth, we look at, how do we create standards and requirements in our contracting? Are there standard clauses that we should be providing when we go to procure AI or go to bid for AI? So we've developed a standards and requirements template. It functions as essentially baseline legal language that you could plug and play into your contract environment or into RFP solicitations as well. And then finally, a common question is, we used AI and something went wrong. Who is responsible for responding to these issues? What is the plan? We also have created an incident response plan, which your security or CISO, system can, agency within your or department within your agency can adopt and plug and play as an incident response plan in your organization to proactively respond to issues or challenges with AI deployments. And we've had some pretty good success so far in terms of adoption of these tools. We are regularly checking in on our members and surveying them to see, okay, are these tools responsive? Are they useful for you? Are you adopting them? And in our most recent poll, we found that 90 agencies have adopted or are adopting GovAI Coalition materials within their agency. That is great. I mean, that's 90 cities or public agencies in the US, and that's super exciting. with the highest adoption rate being for our AI policy. And a big reason for that is that, when we talk to our membership, a lot of agencies are really just right on the cusp. I mean, we have a few leading edge cities, certainly San Jose, for example, that are leading the charge, that are, fully investing in governance teams for AI technology. Most cities are really just at that beginning stage of building policy and trying to think about, okay, what is our approach to AI as an organization? In terms of the overall development of the GovAI Coalition, we're about in the middle of phase 2. Phase 1 was all about building these deliverables. We had several working groups that came together. These are built by public agencies for public agencies. And we've, created those deliverables. And now we're in that phase of refining, revising, listening to our membership and making changes to those deliverables. And also building out, new initiatives within the organization. So for example, we have a data sharing platform that we've launched recently, which allows folks to share data sets that if they're building or training AI internally can be shared and used by other public agencies, for example. And then phase 3 is really an unknown territory. As we grow, we're getting more interest, a lot more requests for partnership from some of the big tech companies like Google and Amazon Web Services. And so as an agency, we're going to field what those partnerships may look like. What I really want to focus on today is the deliverables that we have, and what you might be able to use in order to get started with AI in your organization. So we have several steps for getting started. You can scan this QR code and get access to a quick start guide, which again should get you up to speed in a very basic way for leveraging AI for public service. Our first recommended step is to read through our deliverables guide. We have a really great, super easy to digest one-pager that describes all of the products that we make available through the coalition and how you can use them. And that's available at that QR code there. Again, this is kind of a little bit of an example of what's in that deliverables guide. We provide you with the overall purpose for these documents, how they can be used in a governance process, and really who is responsible or should ideally be responsible for using it. I want to harp again on that AI fact sheet because the fact sheet is really powerful. I've used it already for 2 vendors. And, it asks questions like, okay, what data do you use to train your model, for example? Can you report performance metrics for this algorithm? Do you have a human who monitors the performance of this algorithm in our deployment? And is there appropriate recourse, for example, if somebody wants to opt out of any decision-making outcomes that occur from the use of the algorithm? These are all questions that we think are standardized that we should be asking vendors of AI technology. We don't require as a Gov AI member that you use this tool, but I have found it to be pretty powerful. And honestly, I've found these vendors to actually be very responsive to it. Excited to see the interest from a public agency and the the nerdiness, if you will, or the intelligence from that agency to be a willing partner to really want to understand the technology and the service that's being provided. And so I've been surprised that there's been some really positive feedback from the vendor community in terms of responding to this document. And then, of course, we have, our policy, et cetera. We do provide video tutorials online. So if you're more of a visual learner like I am, you can also just hear a quick 5-minute video that covers the key elements of our deliverables package. In terms of our second step or recommendation for getting started, we recommend building a core AI team within your organization. We know that most cities, certainly San Antonio, doesn't have the resources to hire new positions or go request that city council approve of a team of 10 new people to deal with AI. That tends to be a very lucky situation for a city. So we do recommend, pulling folks from various sectors within your agency and requesting about 5 to 10% of their time to really adopt these sort of key standard documents within your organization to just get you prepped and protected in the event that you do start using AI within your organization. So we suggest existing staff, really looking at key players coming from cybersecurity, legal, from your finance or purchasing teams, certainly your IT department at the leadership level, and then someone to volunteer to participate and receive the updates and information from the GovAI Coalition if you want to join. And certainly these items and products deliverables are entirely free. You definitely don't have to be a member to use them. But as we update them and learn and collaborate as a coalition, we recommend having representation from your agency. Third, we recommend starting with the AI policy. That is really the defining document that captures your overall values for the use of AI within your organization, as well as roles and responsibilities, and notably prohibited uses, which we recommend but don't prescribe. That's very sensitive because we know that cities in different states have different laws already about what types of technologies they can and can't use. For example, many cities have already banned facial recognition. And so that is a form of AI that, might be a prohibited use in your jurisdiction, but it may not be in others. So we do provide some recommendations for prohibited uses, but don't prescribe those. I want to go a little deeper into the AI policy because, again, it's such an important document that really binds us all as GovAI members. It's a plug and play template. So that means that you can edit it freely at your own will. We also highlight areas where we recommend plugging information in that is representative of your agency or environment. For example, if you have existing policies like a data governance policy or a cybersecurity policy, we tell you where you can reference those policies in the document. So it is a very standard kind of template language. Again, you're not required to adopt this to be part of the GovAI coalition, but we do recommend it because, again, it's been developed, by public agencies across the U.S. It's synced up with the other GovAI products. So, for example, it does make reference to the AI fact sheet that I mentioned. It makes reference to the standards and requirements legal language that we've also developed as a product in the coalition. And really the heart of the policy is 4 key activities. First, you should review AI to assess its potential risks. In our AI policy manual, we have an entire breakdown of how to evaluate the risks of AI technologies and classify them accordingly. So very similar to the EU regulation that Kathleen was presenting, there's low, medium, and high risk use cases, and we help you figure out how to classify a novel use case into any one of those 3 categories and take the appropriate response actions. We also recommend that you obtain that technical documentation from the vendor. Again, one of the biggest challenges in this space is actually receiving the information that you need from vendors to be able to effectively evaluate if this tool is suitable for your environment and for a public service. A great example is using AI to sort through housing applications, for example. If you're overwhelmed, you have thousands and thousands of housing applications, and you say, hey, I'm just going to plug this AI in to determine who we should prioritize, that leads to significant risks in terms of potential bias of that tool. So you're going to want to find out from the vendor if they've assessed that tool for bias. Third is, requiring vendors to comply with your contractual requirements and standards. And so again, we've got that piece provided for you as well. And then, of course, the incident response plan. So we're focusing on really those 4 key recommended actions in the policy. In addition to that, we also showcase, values, right? So what are our values? We call them guiding principles for the use of AI, sunset procedures and clauses, and prohibited uses. Touching briefly on, what those values are, we have 8 values that are currently in the policy document. They focus on things like human-centered design, so making sure that AI systems are developed with a human-centered approach that really works to evaluate the impact that these tools will have on successful outcomes for public service. Certainly security and safety, I mean, that's a no-brainer. Privacy, also no-brainer. Transparency, very tricky. We recommend that folks proactively communicate the use of AI tools to their constituents. But more importantly, say that an AI system, its data sources and operational model needs to be understandable. That means to public officials, ideally, as well as the public at large. That's a tall ask. People are coming into the AI field from a lot of different, experiences and background. Great, the light went off in my room. Okay, we're good. So that's a tall ask, and we understand that, but at a minimum, any public official should be able to explain in simple terms what the purpose of this AI tool is and how it works. Equity, also a really big issue. I gave you the example of bias in prioritizing housing applications, for example. So equity is something that we hold very dear as public servants, and that is something that all of our services are intended to address and accommodate. Accountability, so really looking at roles and responsibilities, making sure that if we're using these sensitive technologies, that we have processes by which we can be held accountable. We want our tools to be effective, right? We don't want these tools to not work, and we have a commitment to that. And then the last one, which for my city council is probably the most important item, workforce empowerment. There is a big concern with AI that it will replace jobs. We take the position that AI should supplement the work of city staff, not replace their jobs. Our step 4 is to really look at those prohibited uses. Again, that's probably one of the strongest language components in our AI policy. This is where you're literally detailing what we refuse to do with AI. So we recommend looking at that, modifying it accordingly, and also covering your tracks. Go and talk to all of your departments to make sure that they're not already using technologies that may represent one of those prohibited uses that you plan for. This is a big challenge. City governments are large. Public agencies are large. I have 43 departments and 13,000 employees. So, ensuring that there's compliance across the organization for these policies and that there aren't already use cases that are at play for the use of AI that's in compliance with my policy is a challenge. And so we recommend figuring out as early as possible how you can address that. And then, if you choose to adopt our templates, then, make sure that you are offering those to the right folks in your organization. So we recommend that you deploy that AI fact sheet with your purchasing procurement departments. That the AI policy is reviewed and vetted by your leadership. That can include senior technology staff, offices of innovation, for example, or any senior leadership that is required within your agency. We also recommend that you identify that AI expert, if you will, who will act as a liaison to the GovAI Coalition, and they are responsible for really managing the updates to the policy manual. This is really the toolkit for how the organization will proceed. And then, of course, that your incident response plan goes over to your cybersecurity or CISO. And our step 6 is that you convene, these groups in a regular way in order to establish the policy and the associated governance. So again, having a committee, we know that people in most cities really can't dedicate full-time efforts to AI mitigation or management. But if you can pull folks for 5 to 10% of their time once a month to review any updates or approvals to the policy, or even review use cases that are known within the organization for AI. In our case, we have an intake that is automated or moderated digitally through our IT department. And we go through that intake to ensure that if there's a tool that uses an AI component, that it is run through our process. And finally, share your experiences back with us. We have a lot of really great resources vis-a-vis SharePoint, where you can share with us, how you've modified a policy. As you can see here, we've got Boise, we've got Nashville, Nevada County, San Antonio, my team, have all, put their versions of the policy that they've modified and adopted. And that's such a great resource for cities that are just getting started, particularly smaller cities that may have less infrastructure to start this work early than some of the larger cities in the US. And so I, really want to end this by inviting you to join. Again, there's really no requirement for membership. Obviously, if you're not a public agency, you may not find a lot of value in the public use cases, but you will find a lot of value in exchanging and connecting with other municipal leaders and public agency leaders across the country. Currently, we have an interim board. I'm part of that board, and we have 6 working committees. These committees really cover the sort of main areas of our deliverables. But we also have a new cooperative purchasing committee that is exploring opportunities for GovAI members to do joint solicitations or piggyback contracts, which allow multiple members to come together and say, we are adopting these standards for an AI use case, and we are going to contribute funding collectively to purchase that use case or adopt the contract standards for that use case. So that's a really big deal, really excited about that work. In addition to that, we've got External Affairs Committee and an Adoption Support Committee that really helps public agencies adopt the tools that we have in place. So I think that's really the bulk of my overview. I'm, again, always here to be a resource and connect you. If there's anybody in the coalition that you're interested in learning from or you want to participate, hopefully these QR codes worked. I admit I did not check them all before I gave this presentation, but in any case, you can reach out to me directly and I will be more than happy to plug you right in. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emily. Every time I hear you talk about the GovAI Coalition, I can't help but think how entrepreneurial it is that you guys have created this ad hoc volunteer group, have hundreds of governments now contributing to it across the country in less than a year, and doing all this great work. So thank you for sharing that work with us and for the work you're doing on the coalition. We had one quick question from Serena about the SharePoint site. Is that publicly accessible?
It should be. I can see if I can figure out how to invite you, or if Serena, if you want to send me your email, I should be able to provide that to you.
Cool. Well, I am going to ask questions of the panel for about 15 minutes, and then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. You can use the Q&A function to put your question in the queue, and we'll do our best to get through them. Okay, so I know there were a number of questions that we had talked about that we wanted to discuss as a larger group. I'm going to use a question that combines a few different of the themes that we wanted to talk through based on what we covered today. We talked about bias, and I think the questions and things that Emily has talked about that governments can use in order to assess bias or test it are really important. But can you talk about the difference between using city data versus other data, right? What ChatGPT or public data may be using, and the different considerations for bias that communities might need to think about based on where the data for the AI is coming from. And since this is a little bit of a mashup, well, whoever wants to go first is welcome to take that.
Kathleen, I know she's got thoughts on that one.
I think Emily does too. So I'll put in a few words and then I'll hand it over to Emily. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of attention recently in the press, and there's been a lot of activists who have really been looking at how does bias come out in AI systems. And you know, one of the things I think that's become very obvious in the conversation is that a lot of times we as humans are looking to technology solutions to solve society problems, right? And especially in the case of AI solutions, what we find is that our problems are not being solved, but actually amplified or magnified. And so that's why data is such an important part of the approach to how you think about AI solutions, and thinking really critically about what is the data that was used to train the model that you're thinking about employing. And so Emily talked a little bit about discrimination, for instance, in housing. We can also think about discrimination in other contexts. So think about discrimination if you're talking about mortgages, for instance, or deciding who is going to get a mortgage, or where is it that you should grant mortgages. And then think about the historical context of the United States, especially a lot of us that live in the West that have lived in red lines or red zones areas where based on your race, it was decided whether or not you would get a loan. And if you're looking at historical loans that have been given in a city over time and using that as your base data without considering and measuring and mitigating for the fact that those are highly biased populations of people and highly biased systems that decided how those mortgages would be granted or how that land would be sold. And if you're not thinking really about how can you solve for that when you're designing an AI tool. So this isn't even necessarily for a city to solve for. This is something that the designers of an AI tool should have in mind when they're putting data in the system. How is it you balance that situation so that you don't not only keep repeating the mistakes of the past, but actually make them worse, because now you're using AI to concentrate decision making, and sometimes you don't even understand what is the decision that came out. Like how did the algorithm come to that decision, right? And so, you know, it's really important when we think about bias, and this is why it's really important also that we think about our own historical context in the cities and towns that we live in. What is the historical context that has informed the situation that we're trying to solve, that has informed our personnel hiring practices, our mortgage lending practices, our distribution of assets in the school system, right? And then deciding if those were fair, and if they weren't fair practices in the past, how do we want them to be, and how do we make sure that the AI that we deploy reflects the principles that we hold now and not the principles that we've held in the past?
Yeah.
And Emily, I don't know if you want to add something. But...
Go ahead, Emily.
I mean, I think it's one of the most significant issues in AI currently. There's a lot of different forms of bias that creep into AI. Of course, the training data that it learns from in order to develop the data model that ultimately provides the service. And secondly, I think the industry that builds AI tools and technologies also skews towards white male. And so as a result, we end up with a suite of products that may miss, the lived experiences of our unique communities. One of the biggest worries I have with any out-of-the-box solution, not even just AI, but like any data-based solution, is whether or not the data and the outcomes are representative of my community. So like I get requests all the time from telecommunications companies that want to sell us basically like mobile location data and transportation data from smart cars. And they say, well, we're packaging this up and this is a great opportunity for transportation planning. And I always ask myself, like, well, what is the source of this data? Like, well, it's AT&T. It's like, okay, well, AT&T, and where are they getting that data? It's like, well, it's only from iPhones. And it's like, well, not every single person in my community has an iPhone. This data set is not representative of my community, right? So like that's one example of the ways in which these products and services can be inherently biased. And there's nobody to, force you to ask that question. It's like city governments have to be proactive when they're procuring these technologies to ask those questions. So baking that into policy, baking that into governance processes within the organization ensures that, the city government as a whole is adopting an equity lens to the use of technology in the organization. And really any service that we provide, really needs to consider, those equity issues up front. And, I continue to be concerned with the AI field because just like Kathleen says, it does not necessarily solve for this problem. It might, in fact, accelerate or exacerbate it because now we're automating the process of discrimination, potentially, right? Rather than just looking at how that plays out in terms of the ways that we use data. The other thing that I'll just add is that I think a lot of municipal governments tend to procure these technologies rather than build them in-house. Sad to say, like the state of data retention and collection in city governments today is pretty poor. Like, I don't think a lot of, typical city governments, maybe mid-tier city governments have great, robust data governance. And that's an area that really needs to be improved, in order to support maybe in-house AI systems that truly do address equity or bias, rather than just procuring off-the-shelf solutions that may not do so.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead, Tyler, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that there have always been issues with the data that governments use to make decisions. And just because a company may come to you and say, we're going to train our model on your data, doesn't eliminate the risk of bias. In fact, it may even exacerbate it. And it puts the responsibility on you as government to understand where that bias may exist. And the AI making a decision separates a human from responsibility, right, of whatever that outcome may be. And I think that's the danger is it's really easy to say the AI made this decision when in reality, the AI will not be responsible for the decisions that local government make. So
outcome. I think just from the company perspective too, having a background in the private sector is when you're thinking about solutions for the public sector, but you're considering, where companies are coming from. Most companies are coming from a really good place. Like they think they're solving the problem. They think that they have a good data set. They don't think that they're biased. They think that they're fair. And so just asking the question, like, is your data set biased? They're going to say, like, no, it's not biased, because for them it may not be, right? And they're not coming at it. It's not an intent to deceive. It is just the fact that we all look at the world through our own perspective and worldview. And unless you bring your specific use case and situation to those developers and open their eyes to the idea that there are, number one, consequences to the fact that they might have biased data sets, but number two, that there is a whole group of data that might have been left out because that data has simply never been collected, because the data collection principles have been centered on the privilege, right? And that's fine when you're in the private sector, but when you're in the public sector, we need a tighter lens on how we think about and deploy, like Emily said, not just AI technologies, but all technologies, so that they work for all of the people who we represent.
Yeah, so let me go techie for a second. And so taking everything that was just said, okay, and data bias, left out data sets that would introduce inherent bias, okay, and all of the templates that Emily and team have created over this period of time to get folks started, that this is still a life cycle, right? AI is not an implement and walk away. And hopefully, although there will be some, hopefully not many will be saying, well, the AI did it, I didn't do it. I mean, hopefully our users or those in responsible positions will understand, but we're all human and we know that that is going to happen. But from a support perspective, every time that data set changes, you're introducing some significant potential change to the way the system is going to behave and what the output is going to be, which basically puts you in a regression testing space. Okay, now exactly how that'll be done, what software quality assurance techniques will be applied, AI specific techniques or not, but every time that you make a change, in the same way you would with any application that you've implemented, do some regression testing to make sure it's performing appropriately, so on and so forth. Now you've got an it rather than a thing, and the it is going to give you responses and provide you with output information based on questions you ask it. So in a sense, it is simulating thinking, right? And that all of those thoughts, all of that output is based on whatever data it has access to. And does it correlate that data appropriately all the time? And now introduce a new data set, a change. So every time chat changes, let's say if you're using that as your framework and your foundation, then how much testing do you want to do to make sure that the system is still giving you the same appropriate answers to the same types of questions that it was meant to answer previously, right? And performance testing throughout the life cycle of the product should be imperative. And again, this is a team effort. It's a collaboration between your technology department, your business departments, so on and so forth, so that you have teams that oversight from all angles the reason the business exists and for those business functions. And so that team needs to be responsible for ongoing performance as far as the behavior of the AI based on data, and certainly not wanting to introduce things like bias.
You're on mute, Tyler.
Go,
Thank you.
Tyler.
So we had a great comment in the chat from Greg. He says that all data sets are biased. We cannot set a goal to eliminate bias because nothing is perfect, but we need to be aware of the existing bias. And as such, the AI response can only be a piece of the input into decision making. And I couldn't agree more. I think we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of the good. But we would like it to be better. And I think you guys are helping us to describe closer to what perfection looks like, and the more advice and input that we can implement from this discussion, I think the better our use of AI will be. Anything else to add there?
Comment, yeah, to that, because I loved that comment, and I think it's spot on. It occurred to me at some point, in the middle of these concerns around harmful bias in the organization, that also sometimes we want to have intentional bias. We want to intentionally prioritize certain groups in housing applications or in any kind of public service applications and SNAP benefit applications. We want to prioritize marginalized groups, low-income communities, people of color. So I think we do also potentially may see the deployment of AI systems that are intentionally biased, right? And so I agree that it's really not so much about eliminating bias as it is about mitigating and reducing harmful bias. And that is something that is a conversation that has to vary community by community. So I don't know that there really is a standard for that. I think that's something that a public agency has to be proactive about, working with their residents directly to determine and understand, based on the history and heritage of your community, what does harmful bias mean for San Antonio? What does it mean for San Diego? And build accordingly.
So I think we've talked a lot about being proactive. There are very few actual regulations or policy around AI that you have to follow, which means the responsibility lies on government, local government, who's implementing these solutions, to understand and decide what risk they're comfortable with. But let's talk a little bit about regulation, what the role of federal regulation could be and is in this space. And Emily, I'm going to throw it to you first because I know you have a wonderful opinion on this. And then Kathleen, I know you've done work in the international space as well. So Emily?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I think Kathleen summarized it really well in her presentation. I tend to have a little bit of a negative perspective on this because I find that a lot of the guidelines that are out there from the federal level are excellent ways to steward the conversation nationally. But as a municipality, they aren't that enforceable. So, we have executive orders. We have, the executive order that was issued actually by Trump in 2019, I think 13859 or something. And it actually requires NIST to set standards and regulations for the AI industry. And it also invests really heavily in like R&D for AI. And then we have Biden coming along later and issuing his own executive order that really focused more on security and addressing and defining responsible AI and ensuring that we're protecting innovation while also safeguarding from, the negative effects of AI. 2022, we have a blueprint for a AI Bill of Rights, which was really exciting to see. And I think generally that document was very successful and comprehensive. And we also, of course, have the NIST risk management framework. This one is probably the most widely adopted by public agencies that I'm aware of, because there's a general standard for public agencies to align with NIST, especially around risk. And so their RMF framework for AI has been pretty useful. And then, of course, more recently, we've seen department by department at the federal level, including the OMB, issue their own guidance for how they're going to address AI. So I think a lot of those are excellent signposts that we can draw inspiration from, and that we can strive to align with. I think at the local level, it just becomes so applied that, we really have to start taking action and enforcing kind of our own policies, community by community. And we have different tools at our disposal to do that on the ground. I think one of the most important ones is procurement. Putting standards and requirements as we contract for these technologies is really one of the best ways to lead to the types of outcomes that we want to see. And we have ordinances and we have policies. But I also want to flag that there are limits on those powers too. There was a great article in the Washington Post recently that talked about how cities that have banned facial recognition, their police departments are pulling facial recognition data from neighboring cities or jurisdictions. So there is a real issue with the geographic localization of legislating or pushing ordinances that define the use of AI for a specific geographic region. When you're surrounded by other regions that don't have those rules, you have this cross-pollination that might be problematic. And so that's where I think federal regulation really does play an important role. And ultimately, the GovAI Coalition has sprouted as a way to counteract the lack of legislation that would require potentially the private sector to do certain things to protect from potential harms to consumers for public sector AI. We see some legislation coming out for the healthcare industry and its use of AI, and I'd love to see that also occur for public sector AI as well. But it's not there yet. So cities have to kind of come together and try to align. And that's really the best that I think we can do right now.
Holy cow, that was like really useful and informative and comprehensive. That was a great answer, Emily. I'm just going to build a little bit on what she said, and as a policy person, I've worked in technology policy for a long time, and we've seen technology policy evolve, right? Especially over the last 10 years, you've seen like a really rapid evolution of technology policy, and AI is coming in exactly at a time when governments have developed like a little bit of a muscle around how to deal with technology. We're also, just thinking about the moment that we're living in. We're living in a moment where the technology of the past, like the internet giants and the promises they brought of making the world a better place, all of us have realized that that was a promise that could never have been true, right? They could never have done what they thought they were going to do, although it was their aspiration. It wasn't a lie. Like, we all wanted that to be true, but it's just not true, right? And so now we're living in the shadow of what that has, you know, the distrust that that's left us with as governments, as citizens, as humans that have a, you know, basically to interact with the world, you have to interact with technology in some way. It is very difficult to get away from it. And so we're living in this shadow where we have to interact, but a lot of times we hate it, right? And so governments and their role have two different approaches. One is that they need to create regulations that protect their citizens. Like, that's the number one thing that a government is meant to do, right? Is to create rules and regulations that provide for the security of the people that live within or that are within their geographic boundaries, right? But the other thing they need to do is make sure that there's prosperity. And so when you're looking at some of these regulations and the perspectives that governments around the world are bringing to it, there's this push and pull of, number one, what is the security that we need to guarantee for people through the regulations that we pass? And number two, what are the protections that we need to ensure that we don't get left out of this innovation economy that might have to do with AI, and might have to do with lots of different things, right? And how that's played out in technology is that governments, well, really how it's played out over history is that governments chase problems. Governments are rarely ahead of a problem. They're generally solving for something that went wrong. And so we're in an interesting place right now in terms of regulation where governments recognize that there are serious things that could go wrong with AI, but none of that has actually been realized yet. And so you have a few consequences of that. Number one is that you don't have a huge political will to get things done at the federal level because there's no kind of real impulse from the people on the ground. We're not mad enough yet, right? For regulation to bring the lawmakers together and say, like, this is what we're going to prioritize. This is serious enough for us to forget about the debt, for us to forget about the other things we have to legislate and legislate this. We're not there yet, right? And so while we're not quite there yet, which we do, and that gets to a place where Emily was saying we need to self-regulate both as a private sector and as a public sector and start establishing the principles that should guide that regulation, right? And what we've seen, for instance, if you draw from privacy regulations, is that the principles that have informed regulation in that sphere, they are not new to that regulation conversation. They are hundreds of years old as to what humans have expected for privacy and how they want that to be reflected in the technologies that we use. And we mostly are getting to privacy regulation because people feel violated. They feel like those principles that they understand and hold dear are not being respected. And therefore, you're seeing some actions at state level. But the federal government, I think in the United States, is still very much thinking about getting it wrong. And what are the consequences of getting legislation wrong? And what's worse, getting it wrong or doing nothing at all? And I don't think we've answered that question yet, right? So I don't think we can look to the federal government to solve it.
Yeah, I think in the US,
we have time left, Tyler, or are we reaching the end here?
We've got 2 minutes left. We've got a couple comments in the chat I'll read. Not a ton of time, so we'll probably wrap up here in a second with closing thoughts. So Greg said we're frogs in the boiling water, the AI boiling water. And Ken said that he'd like to stress the importance of stakeholder involvement and pre-thinking your responses to situations. If you have a privacy hack or a cyber attack, improvisation in that space is never a great way to get to a good result. So planning is important. Okay, so let's wrap up. We talked about a lot of things, but any closing comments that people want to leave people with that they haven't mentioned already?
Yeah, I think I'd like to say that, you know, there was a slide and that Ken had in his slide deck a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure many of others have seen it. But it's basically, you know, how long it's taken for technology to be adopted up to 1 million users. And, you know, back when the internet launched and so on, I mean, it took a very long time. But when it came down to ChatGPT and its launch, it took 2 months, if I'm not mistaken. And so I think there's a lot of comparisons from a government action perspective now in the same way there were synonymous activities going on back in the Bush administration when they came out with cybersecurity executive orders and so on. And I think some people would like to be able to say at this moment that it is the frog in the boiling water, and you're turning, the hot water, you're turning it up slowly and slowly. But the reality is this thing is moving ahead at an incredible pace. And as government servants and as just citizens of the country, we really, really do need to be very aware of what's going on. We don't always have to understand everything, know who our sources are to get the real, get good information from. But we're potentially at a historic turning point. I mean, many have said it, the 15,000th or millionth to say it, but the reality is that things are changing very quickly. So that hot water, that frog is not going to have time to slowly simmer up. The way things look right now, it's going to start to boil in 3 minutes. So, let's stay on top of it and all be good citizens. And hopefully everyone will have plenty of success and opportunity to innovate around the technology.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for helping us do that. I really, really appreciate it. This is recorded. We'll be sharing it with everyone as well. And, best of luck on your AI implementations. Let's try to do it ethically. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.